traders, and welcome to another video on sentiment. Today's video is going to be on BitMEX Funding, and this was the Patreon suggested video, and I put this up for about 5 to 6 weeks beforehand, and no one had voted it until now. So without further ado, we're going to be talking about how funding works, and then we're also going to be talking about funding and how we can use it as sentiment with deciding when to buy and deciding when to sell. Now, I had originally made this video a lot more complicated. This is another video, like a rewrite of that video that I'm doing now. I am going to be doing more of a complex how BitMEX works and going a lot deeper into the BitMEX funding rate. But this video is going to be more of a strategy video and a theory video than math and calculations and understanding really how that works. Well, how funding works for BitMEX is BitMEX uses perpetual future swaps. So this is the same thing as a futures contract, except the futures contract is constantly renewed, making it last forever. You can hold it for a year, you can hold it for 5 years, you could hold a position for 10 minutes if you wanted to. And that's really a big benefit of using BitMEX over other futures brokers. The way that BitMEX operates is BitMEX funding is made every 8 hours. So every 8 hours, when you hold a position, you are either going to be paying or you're going to be receiving funding based on other traders in the market of BitMEX. Now, when the rate is positive, so let's say the funding rate's at 0.1% on the 8 hour. So every 8 hours, currently it's at 0.1%. That would mean that anyone who holds a long position is going to be having to pay 0.1%. Anyone who holds a short position will get paid, will receive 0.1%. And when the rate is negative, shorts are going to pay longs. So let's say the funding rate was negative 0.2%. Then longs will receive 0.2% and shorts will pay 0.2% of their position. So really the way that BitMEX does this, another way you can think about it, is they're incentivizing people to trade against the trend. So you get paid to trade against the crowd, which I think is pretty cool because a lot of the trading that I like to do and I like to talk about is contrarian, trading against the masses kind of trading. So BitMEX does allow you to do this and to make a profit off of it, off of just the funding rate itself. BitMEX also provides a predicted funding rate, which is in the left tab of the BitMEX site. So what this does is it tells you what the next funding rate in the next of the next 8 hours, what the funding rate's likely to be. But the funding rate that's predicted by BitMEX is not always going to be the actual funding rate that does occur. All right, so now let's look at funding as trading sentiment. So a few things. Typically, positive funding is going to lead to bearish price movement. This is by no means a 100% thing where if funding is very positive, that it's very likely that price is going to go down. All this means is that there is a higher likelihood that price is going to be going down on BitMEX if funding is very positive for a prolonged period of time. And the reason this is because when funding is very, very high for a very long period of time, we know that the demand to buy, the demand to go long, the demand to make a 100x long position is very high, which is telling me that many retail traders are likely greedy and desperate, trying to buy into an uptrend to try to make a quick profit. And on the other side, when funding is very negative, that's what's telling me that everyone believes the price is just going to keep going down. We have many shorts entering who are trying to make a quick profit, and really not many retail traders on BitMEX are seeing an upside for Bitcoin. And if you've learned anything about the sentiment from my videos, you know that when a lot of people believe that it's going to go down, it typically is actually going to go up. When a lot of people think it's just going to keep going up, that's typically when price begins to go down. So this is when we like to put on our contrarian, hat and look for when funding is positive and look to try to short, and look for when funding is negative and try to go long. Also, the longer that the funding rate stays at an extreme, the better the signal. So if we have just, funding kind of just chilling at, let's say, daily funding is at 0.3%, or that's pretty high, 0.1%, and then it jumps to like 0.375, and then it stays at 0.375 for some time, that's a very strong sign that funding is very high. Because just one reading of funding can be good, just one spike in funding or one spike down in funding can be a good thing to trade with, but some traders like to wait for that funding rate to stabilize at a high level before taking the other side of the trade. And finally, before we get to the charts and the fun stuff with the sentiment, just before the funding rate occurs, which occurs on the dot every 8 hours, high price volatility may ensue as traders may not want to pay the funding rate. So if the funding rate's at 0.3% on the daily, so that means funding's every 8 hours. So I'm grouping that together. So that's 3. You're paying 3 funding. You're paying 8 hours during that day. You pay, and then next 8 hours, the next 8 hours. But if throughout that day, throughout the 3 times that you pay, you're paying a total of, let's say, like 0.3%. So you're paying 0.1% each one of those 8 hours. Some traders might just exit their long right away because they just don't want to be paying that high of a percentage. And that could cause some very high volatility because many traders may not want to pay that rate. All right, so now let's take a look at the price chart. So we're going to be looking at it on the 4-hour and on the daily, and we're going to start with the daily chart. And what we have here is XBT USD. And a quick note on the settings before we delve into the fun part of looking at the funding rates. It's going to be blue or orange, back here when, let me just double click to show. When the accuracy is reduced, so these numbers may or may not have been the actual funding during that interval. So that's why I have that checked. And additionally, it's green or red when we know for a fact that was the funding rate. So this is just an accuracy thing. We know that these this is good data, and this may or may not have been correct, but I'm still going to be referencing both, just giving more weight to this one, of course. Also, you can't really see it, but it also provides the predicted funding rate at that time. So if I was to hit, like that, make it very bold, you can kind of see it. But that's something you can look at if you really want to just get more out of this indicator. You can begin to look at the relationship between predicted funding rates and actual funding rates, and when they are when the predicted rate was actually the funding rate, when the predicted rate was way off the funding rate, and what kind of impact that has on price. So what we're going to be looking at here, let me get that back to 0, is let's first take a look at this point in time here. So right about when we begin to trust, the accuracy of these values. So here I see we have a positive funding rate of 0.189 per day. And that's during June 9th, 2018. I'm reading that number right here, by the way. So 0.189. So what that means is during this day, longs would have to pay that value, that percentage, to shorts, and shorts would receive that value from the longs. And naturally, just as I had put here, we do get bearish price movement, and price does go right down here. And then the interesting thing happens where funding actually got very negative. We had a daily funding rate extreme of negative 0.5. So during this day, if you were short, you would have to pay 0.5% for that day, just to stay short. So this is showing me an extreme demand for many traders wanting to go short here, or extreme supply, because we're talking about selling and talking about shorting. And what this is also telling me, in just zooming out from BitMEX and not just talking about BitMEX, is that the crypto world as a whole, so many other exchanges likely have many retail traders who are likely selling or likely shorting, and this is just a representation of that overall whole. Because typically, what I've noticed is if I have a lot of retail traders selling on a major exchange, typically on other exchanges, there's going to be a lot of retail traders selling at similar price points, because retail traders tend to act like a herd. They tend to react to the same kind of stimuli in basically the same way. So that's why I like to use one exchange as a proxy for the overall market as a whole. And we can see that here. We had a very negative funding rate and price went up. And if we even zoom in more here, we can see that price went up here until it began to go down. But once it began to go down, the funding rate actually went negative, down to its local high of negative 0.1929. And it was at this point that price just couldn't really find many more sellers. The longs were incentivized to buy, and price went up. And price continued to go up here, as you can see, until we began to have very, very positive funding. We had a funding rate daily of 0.4151, so very high daily funding right here, right about at these doji candles, and then price went down. And price did go down until, of course, funding turned negative. And then once funding turned negative, price went back up. Funding was slightly positive, not really much you can read from that. But what we can read is after price cascaded very quickly down, within a few days, I think it was down like 20% from high to low of this market top to this market low. The funding had turned very, very negative, down to negative 0.2964, as you can see here. And this is where price began to move back up. So price went from this low at about 61 up to its high of about 11.88%. It went up there once, and then it went up there twice as well, as you can see. And then funding got very positive again, right there, and then price went down. Funding got very, actually slightly negative here, and then price went up. So that's just the daily for looking at this more recent data. But let's take a look at the more historical data that may or may not be completely accurate. But it still does reveal some important things, such as here, where we had very negative funding for a prolonged period of time, from the beginning of this downtrend to really the end of the stabilization of this downtrend here. A lot of traders looking to large demand to short here, as you can see. And then price actually just began to move up. But the interesting thing here is that you can see the funding rate was very high here, but price just persisted. Price just continued to go higher, which, what do you do with this? Hope you don't short there. That would not be good. But I hope you do short here, because this is a spot where funding was positive for a very long time. And not only was funding positive, funding was capped at its very high, 1.125% per day. So if you were long here, you would be paying a very large funding rate. And if you were short, you would be paid a large funding rate. You'd make 1.125% per day if you had been short at this top. And you would have also profited from the speculation, of course. But we can begin to see where, negative funding here did lead to the price move up. Positive funding eventually led to price move down. But I don't really like looking at this data as much because, I don't like it when I'm looking at data that's not fully accurate. That can be a little bit troubling. But we can see negative funding here leads to a price rise, and then price rose and stabilized after we got more positive funding. Really positive funding here, and price just continued to go down. What I typically look at is not the daily. I just wanted to show this as more of a zoom out. What I like to look at is the 4 hour. Because this is going to show much more detailed trends of how prolonged a period of funding is, and also the price action that occurs right when that funding rate hits. So if we even look here, we can see that was when the funding rate had been very positive, as you can see here, and price went down. And then we can see just about here, period of consolidation, negative funding. This would have been a spot to look for a long, and you would have made this. And if we go back a little bit farther too, we can see this one's interesting because it is an outlier. It's not extreme negative funding, that we typically like to look for, like, something like this. But we had a long period of positive, and then we had a period of negative here, and then price went up. I don't want to say that this is, an 100% sure thing. It really isn't. It's just showing how many traders are looking, how many traders are desperate to buy, how many traders are desperate to sell. And the funding rate to me reflects that, fear and greed. That's what I'm trying to look at here. And that's what I'm looking at when I'm looking at this very negative funding. I want to buy. when we get this funding that's this negative and price goes up and you get rewarded for buying. And I want to sell when I begin to see this, because this is telling me that other buyers, other longs are beginning to demand, to try to get into positions and pushing up that funding rate. And, here I would have been beautiful to buy with this very, very negative funding, and then a prolonged period of a negative funding rate that, would have been a great basis for buying for a medium or even a longer term position. And then here as well, you can see a prolonged period of a very high interest rate for the 4 hour. This is every 8 hours, you can see, but we're representing it on the 4 hour. And this had occurred right before the downtrend began. But contrary point to BitMEX Funding, you can see that once funding did turn negative, which typically we expect bullish action, price just continued to go down a lot here. So this is why we need to be very careful about looking at BitMEX Funding by itself. This is not an indicator you can use just in conjunction with price action, in conjunction with volume, and just have that be it. I would highly recommend looking at other factors as well, at least one other sentiment factor. That could be, sentiment percent, which I love to look at. And if you see a severe drop off in long percent, you could look to buy. If you see a severe jump in long percent, you could look to sell, or here, drop off in long percent, we look to buy. You could look at trades per minute, which I recently did a video on. You could look at the bid-ask sum, which is looking at buying pressure for selling pressure in the order book, which I also recently did a video on. You could look at CVD, the cumulative volume delta, on tensorcharts.com, which is just market buy minus market sell across a few exchanges that they offer. But this is not something that I would recommend you just use and hope for the best. I think that this is a great tool to use for someone who's looking to medium-term trade. Now, the final thing that I want to talk about is this other point here that I made, where the just before funding, the high price volatility. So we can actually look at that by looking at a very short time frame, by looking at the 5 minute, but still keeping that funding on. Now, the funding is going to be very, sparse, as you can see here. But just before we get that very high funding, sometimes we can get some higher volatility. So here we can see the funding rate turned negative here. And just when that happened, price went down very quickly. I'm looking for another. Not really the best examples here. Here's one. Ooh, yeah, this one's interesting. So we can see that the funding rate here went from very positive to slightly less positive. So if you were long here, you would have to pay a large amount of money, and if you were long here, you would not have had to pay as much money, and maybe that's why price was able to stay up there. But yeah, that's just another thing you can look at the more shorter term aspect of funding and looking for volatility and looking for the immediate market reaction to that funding, as you can see here and here. But I still prefer just to use on the medium term, long term basis and just use on the 4 hour. Look for a prolonged period of either positive funding to short or sell, and then look for a prolonged period of negative funding to try to long or buy. And I mean, this can just be another tool to add to your sentiment trading arsenal. So that's going to do it for today's video. A relatively simple video that I wanted to do for quite some time. A very advanced, just deep dive into BitMEX, how it works, more of the complex and fun stuff about perpetual swaps. I might be doing that in the future, and I'm probably going to be putting that to a Patreon vote. And if you have any questions about how funding works or about sentiment in general, why is it that negative funding typically leads to bullish movement, or why is it that positive funding typically leads to bearish movement, then feel free to leave a comment or to contact me on the Discord or on my Patreon. With that, happy trading.